Payment Pulse, a podcast by Clearent by Xplor, a leading full-service payments provider. Welcome to Payment Pulse, a podcast by Clearent by Xplor, where our goal is to humanize and simplify the complex world of payments. My name is Steve Bell, and I'm here with my co-host Max. How we doing today, man?
I'm good. Good to see you, Steve.
You as well. Wasting no time. We're going to jump right into it. Really trying to cut the fluff here, but our topic today is how microeconomics helps to explain consumer spending. This is the first episode in our mini-series where we're covering all of the consumer spending behaviors, a really interesting topic that I think you'll find value in. It's not something we typically think about, but our goal throughout this series is to dive into various schools of thought that explain why consumers choose to spend the way that they do. As a payments and software service provider, one of our primary goals at Clearent is to consistently aim towards making life easy for our customers, which includes both our partners and our merchants, as well as the consumers that interact with the technology as well. The critical role that we play in the payments experience is why we are diving deep into this topic. So whether it's answering why consumers choose to pay with card versus cash, or why credit card spending varies across demographics, or why new technologies are or aren't gaining transactions with consumers. We're digging into some of the fundamental reasons why consumers are spending the way that they do. With that being said, Max, today's topic is consumer decision-making and how microeconomics helps to explain it. Can you start by breaking down what we mean when we say microeconomics?
Yeah, sure, Steve. I'm happy to. Well, at its most fundamental level, microeconomics, or micro as I might call it throughout the episode, is a subfield of economics that studies how individual consumers, kind of people like you and I, and producers like the businesses that we shop from, make decisions. Plain and simple. This differs from macroeconomics, which looks at broader trends in the market, like changes in national income or employment. But let's stick to the microeconomics piece. The theories of microeconomics essentially help to explain consumer decision-making and how that leads to overall demand for goods and services. For example, why someone might buy one product over another or decide to save instead of spend. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now that you've kind of given that brief introduction to microeconomics, let's set the groundwork for how microeconomics theory helps to explain how consumers make certain decisions about payments and consumption.
Yeah, so the most fundamental part of understanding decision-making by consumers is what we call consumer theory in micro. And that partakes in understanding the trade-offs that consumers make for services and goods over other services and goods. So let's just take an example. Steve, what are some items that you like to collect in your day-to-day?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, over the years, I've definitely, gained an unhealthy amount of shoes and hats, but it's what I love.
Shoes and hats. Okay, so it's a good example. Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's envision that you're happy with some kind of combination of shoes and hats. Let's say that you have a shoe collection and a hat collection that you're always updating, regardless of your economic situation. And at any given time, you can have a certain amount of shoes and a certain amount of hats in your collection. What's roughly the ratio of shoes to hats that you would kind of say is your go-to ratio?
Yeah, I mean, at a minimum, I'd probably say 2 hats for every one pair of shoe. That seems fair.
Seems fair, right? Now, let's say for argument's sake that you have a collection of 10 shoes, 20 hats, right? So 2 to 1. If I were to say, Steve, I'd like to take 9 of your 10 pairs of shoes, how many hats would I have to give you to force you into that situation?
Well, if you're taking my whole collection or most of my collection, I'd probably need a lot more than 2 for every one shoe.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And what you're describing here is roughly what's called the marginal rate of substitution. And that's the rate at which you're willing to trade one or more goods for another while maintaining that same level of happiness or utility. And so in microeconomics, it teaches us that humans are utility maximizing creatures, meaning we're always making decisions that provide us with the greatest satisfaction possible based on what we have and what we want. Anywhere along this kind of curve, if you think of like an XY axis, you have shoes on one axis and hats on the other axis. You would be happy with some combination uh, of shoes and hats as long as in your mind it's a equal trade-off. So if you have at the moment 20 hats and 10 pairs of shoes, you might want uh, more of one good in order to start trading me some shoes, and I would have to give you many more hats than just two to one hat, as we explained earlier. And if we, add in budget and we add in like how much you actually have to spend on shoes and hats, we start to figure out where your optimal price point is. And usually, um, when this, happens in real life, we typically try to buy things, and especially things such as shoes and hats, which are, some to your level, they often become luxury items because you're collecting them and you're perhaps buying them more than you need to buy them. They become this kind of, you typically have a balance, right, based on your budget. So, does that make sense? How that all kind of comes together?
Yeah, yeah. In theory, that absolutely makes sense. What does that have to do with consumer decisions and when paying for goods in the real world? For example, I'm not out there just buying shoes and hats all the time as, I wish I could, but I'm buying groceries, getting a haircut, paying rent, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it gets fun. So we all play this trade off game in our heads a bit subconsciously. But instead of weighing the trade off between two items, as we've highlighted already, we weigh the trade offs of a good or service against everything else we could use that money for. For example, let's say you're deciding how to spend a tax refund. On one hand, you could spend it on a new pair of shoes. On the other hand, there are other things in your life that might be worth saving for. If you already have a large shoe collection, what's another pair of shoes? To some people, it's amazing, yes. To other people, it's not worth as much another pair of shoes. We're always playing this trade-off game of how to decide what the next purchase is. And see, this is what economists refer to psychological accounting. This mental framework we use to categorize and evaluate spending decisions. Everyone places a slightly different value on their basket of goods, depending on their preferences and priorities. Does that still kind of jive with your understanding of this kind of new topic?
It does, yeah. But things for the prices of things are changing. So in that case, then what?
Well, and it depends. So, that you bring up a good point. When the price of a good goes up, say because of inflation, your ratio of goods in your basket, as I previously mentioned, changes to a new price. If let's just say one item goes up in price, say your shoes become more expensive, you might substitute them out with something cheaper, or you might have to shift the spending in the rest of your basket to, the new situation, the new price for your shoes. Um, and so, higher costs for the entire basket will obviously um, shrink how much in your basket you can buy. But the change in price for one good might just shift around or force you to change your preferences. So that's kind of the hard part about this is you're constantly making those trade offs in your head.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's why this is so interesting because that's not even something I had even considered. The trade off graph, but it makes total sense. So what? Let's bring it back. Like, how does this then tie to payments? Like, what does that have to do with payments?
Yeah. So this is really where the rubber meets the road for consumers. Imagine you're at a checkout, ready to swipe your card or click purchase online. You're asking yourself, do I have the budget for this? And now, if someone said, like, you could you could buy those shoes today, have those shoes today, and still have money for everything else, those more expensive shoes, and still have money for everything else in your basket, um, and maybe just pay for it later, um, you know, we'd be pretty happy. We'd be like pretty psyched that, like, hey, we could have everything we want despite higher prices. Well, that's essentially kind of the basis of some of our credit card systems today. You know, credit cards kind of distort the psychological accounting matrix that we have in our heads by making it easier to justify purchases we might not otherwise be able to afford, or that we might make if we were rationally thinking about the total budget that we have. And so, some credit cards make it easier to stick to budgets, while others encourage more spending outside of our budgets. And studies show that people are more willing to spend on leisure and entertainment when they are mentally separating those funds, right? So, funds for vacation and, travel and all that, versus the groceries and necessities that we typically have. That's why, like, when we use budgeting apps, we typically have different icons and charts to show how much we're spending on one or the other, because budgeting company, these tech companies who have built these platforms understand, how human behavior typically works psychologically. So all that's to say is, in terms of payments, um, the technology that we use to pay for things definitely distorts the mental accounting that we have developed over the years. And sometimes it helps us, and sometimes it hurts us.
Yeah, that's I mean, the distortion of, psychological accounting by the use of credit cards is it really is so interesting, and I can absolutely attest, in my younger years, some of those feelings as you're getting your first credit card, and some are better, managing that than others. But now let's consider the payment technologies that are also impacting how they've changed the game for consumers. I have a few that I want to ask you about, and so let's start with the first one on the list, and that's online checkout.
Yeah, so online checkout systems have totally streamlined the buying process. I don't think there's any doubt in our minds there. And mostly because they've removed the barriers that might otherwise delay a purchase. From a microeconomic perspective, these systems reduce the transaction costs, meaning the effort and time required to make the purchase. Um, this reduction, the friction, in buying something, increases the likelihood that a consumer will complete the purchase, particularly for low cost or impulse items. So I'm sure you'll tell me that you had this experience at some point. But I typically think of going through Instagram and I see like a hat that I really like. I'm also a hat guy. And if it's $30 and it's like right there and I can click it right there, I'm doing it. I'm impulsively just buying it right there because it's just available. Does that kind of feel like it resonates?
Yeah, I mean, Instagram got me on a hat just last week, so it's absolutely relatable.
Yeah.
But yeah, that the ease of transaction, with essentially online checkout has progressed even further, right? With Instagram ads and autofill, Amazon with like the click to buy, kind of immediately and not having to go to the cart and do extra steps, basically.
Hmm.
It's really interesting, but
Yep.
the next one that I have on my list is credit card points. Let's dive into that.
Yeah. So credit card points introduce this interesting dynamic where we all of a sudden become incentivized by the rewards of credit cards. And it incentivizes us to spend, and effectively reduces our perceived price of the purchase. So a good example is you getting cash back. By offering cash back or maybe travel miles, we for the redeemable goods that our card offer, for the redeemable goods that like the card is suited for, the credit card is shifting consumer preferences towards those types of purchases. So it taps into the psychological tendency to maximize reward, which often leads to increased spending or choosing higher priced goods than we otherwise might have mentally budgeted for. So again, like I look at airlines as a great example, and typically a very common one. We typically justify a big flight somewhere, or going and visiting, making a kind of impromptu trip somewhere, because we're like, hey, we'll get the points. Like it'll pay dividends down the road. And if I use it enough, I can get into the lounge, or I can, get points, cash back down the road for groceries or whatnot. And it stimulates this reward system in our heads that, hey, making this purchase will pay dividends for us down the road or makes it the current purchase cheaper. Does that kind of jive with you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm personally a travels miles stacker, so
Yeah.
that's kind of where I lean towards. And like you said, that's a very popular one. But um, yeah, it's interesting to see how cards and the reward systems that are attached to specific cards influence then where you're spending your money as well.
Yep. Yep.
So yeah, again, really interesting. Um, this next one as well. It's a newer technology, but it's really taken off, and I'm very curious on your perspective on this one, Max. But buy now, pay later. Dive into that for me.
Yeah, buy now pay later is kind of the hot topic in the last few years of fintech, and buy now pay later, services. Just for those who are kind of a little familiar with it and need more of a background, are services that allow consumers to distribute the cost of a purchase over multiple payment cycles, often with little to no interest. And from a microeconomic perspective, buy now, pay later shifts that immediate trade off that you have to make in in and reduces the upfront financial burden of a purchase. So, just as we mentioned earlier in the shoe example, let's say you have a $200 shoe, and you're like, that doesn't really fit within my budget at the moment. But the company you're paying, buying it from, Nike, Reebok, whatever it might be, says, hey, you can buy now and pay it over the course of time, and it'll be $20 increments every, for the next 10 months. In your, or with a bit of interest in there. In your head, you might be like, oh, this all of a sudden turned from a $200 purchase to a $20 purchase just here and now. And this essentially spreads out the payments and reduces the pain of paying associated with larger one-time purchases, and encourages consumers to spend more freely, to spend a bit more above their means, and to take their budget line and say, oh, I have all of a sudden much more budget in my pocket. So it makes it more accessible to consumers psychologically, but of course it comes with the fear that the risk that that's over the course of time and accumulating more and more buy now pay later arrangements that you're putting yourself in a pretty precarious spot as a consumer.
Yeah, it's really that one is so interesting again because it's so new, but they all pertain to again, the disbursement of payments and making it easier to pay ultimately and get people to actually complete a transaction. So
Hmm.
all three really great payment technologies that are relevant to this subject. So
Yeah,
really appreciate the breakdown on that, Max.
absolutely.
But let's tie it all back together, and we're going to wrap up here with the kind of final thoughts.
Yeah, so the most important thing here, Steve, is the magic I'll say of microeconomics is that when we compile all these decisions that a consumer makes and we spread it across a population of people, that provides us the insights into what is the demand for products. As we kind of mentioned, the way I was framing a lot of these technologies and how they impact consumers is, it creates more demand for goods because all of a sudden people's purchasing power has gone up, and the big reminder for folks in the industry who are using payments technology is that these technologies allow people to approach um, consumption more freely. Now, of course, it comes with some risks, but if in a world where there's continuously more and more change in how people spend, these can be really powerful tools to encourage folks to consume at your shop or using the technology that you're using across other merchants. So yeah, there's a lot of great technologies out there, and we're getting, you know, the payments technology trend is only going towards expanding the reach of uh, consumer spending. So really, it's really exciting, a really exciting time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that breakdown, Max. It really is. It's an interesting time, and it's really a fascinating subject on how, excuse me, on how microeconomics provides that framework for understanding the choices that we make as consumers. From deciding between shoes and hats to weighing the value of essentials versus luxuries. It's all about trade-offs and maximizing satisfaction. So concepts like marginal rate of substitution help to explain why we make these decisions, and psychological accounting highlights how our mental framework shape the spending habits that we have.
Yeah.
Technologies like we talked about a second ago, online checkout, reduce friction, credit card points reward our purchases, and buy now, pay later shifts the burden of payments, making it easier than ever for consumers to access what they want and get the things that they need with the budget that they have and the trade-offs that they have to make. Ultimately, by connecting these dots, we not only better understand individual behavior, but we also gain insights into larger economic patterns like supply and demand. And that's really the magic of microeconomics and why it's so relevant to the payments world today. Again, I don't think it's things that we often think about as business owners, software providers, but it really is an interesting thing to consider and should be watched and monitored. But
Absolutely.
yeah, Max, kind of closing it out here. I think that was a really good episode, a lot of value in it. We do have more coming in this micro series that we mentioned as well. This is just the first that we wanted to break down as it's really important. But
Yeah.
yeah, let us know what you guys think, your feedback on this episode, and just kind of what your opinions are for this impact of microeconomics and the frameworks that we labeled out today. So let us know whether you're watching on YouTube. Check out our social media where we're sharing these as well. Really want this to be engaging and see how you guys feel about it. So drop a comment and stay tuned for the future episodes coming every Friday. But yeah, we appreciate you guys, and we will see you next week.